Hello, good afternoon. My name is Andrew Murtha, and I'm the Vice Dean of Faculty Affairs at Johns Hopkins SAIS. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone here to the first Faculty Research Forum of the 2021 academic year. I want to first of all thank Pedro Mattia, Jessica Moreno, Isabel Taiping Long, Yanan Nagata, and everybody else who made this event possible. The Faculty Research Forum is a venue where faculty showcase their recent work to their SAIS colleagues and invited guests. It was created by my predecessor as Vice Dean, Kent Calder. Dean Calder is here today, so I'd like to take the opportunity to recognize him and ask that you join me in doing so. Due to the virtual nature of today's forum, we're happy to welcome members of the general public as well. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Dan Markey and James Green to this panel. We had plans to host this event in the spring when Dan's book was first published, but the event was postponed due to the early stages of the pandemic, and so this event is much overdue. Professor Markey is a senior research professor at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. He also serves as the academic director of the SAIS Global Policy Program, where he teaches courses in international politics and policy. Professor Markey's latest book, China's Western Horizon, Beijing and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia, was published by Oxford University Press in March of this year. It assesses the evolving political, economic, and security links between China and its Western neighbors, including Pakistan, India, Kazakhstan, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. It explains what these changes are likely to mean for the United States and recommends steps that Washington should take in response. Professor Markey's accomplishments are both extensive and impressive. From 2007 to 2015, Dan was a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. While there, he wrote a book on the future of the US-Pakistan relationship, No Exit from Pakistan, America's Tortured Relationship with Islamabad, Cambridge University Press, 2013. Before that, between 2003 and 2007, Dan held the South Asia portfolio on the Secretary's policy planning staff at the US Department of State. Prior to government service, he taught in the Department of Politics at Princeton University, where he also served as executive director of Princeton's research program in international security. Earlier, he was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard's Olin Institute for Strategic Studies. Professor Markey is the author of numerous reports, articles, book chapters, and opinion pieces. His commentary has been featured widely in the US and in the international media. He is, I also hasten to add, a terrific colleague. In the short time I've been here at SAIS, I've learned a great deal from Dan. James Green is a senior fellow at Georgetown University. He is the creator and host of the US-China Dialogue podcast and a senior advisor at the global consulting firm McClarty Associates. Mr. Green has worked for over 2 decades on US-China relations for the US government and in the private sector. From 2013 to 2018, he served as the Minister Counselor for Trade Affairs at the USTR at the US Embassy in Beijing, where he addressed market access barriers, technology policy, and investment restrictions. In addition to his government service on national security, on the National Security Council, and on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, Mr. Green ran the Government Relations Department at the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. James obtained his undergraduate degree from Brown University, but most importantly for us anyway, James is also a SAIS alumnus. Before ceding the microphone to Professor Markey, let me go over just a few housekeeping rules. Following Dan's remarks on his book, James will provide some comments and we will continue with the discussion that I will then moderate. Members of the audience, of the virtual audience, should use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to pose questions. Not the chat function, but the Q&A function. And you could do that at any time. At the end of our discussion, sometime around 1 p.m., I will then bring in the questions that you raised, and we will have a Q&A session where I'll ask Dan and James to address them. So without any further ado, Dan, the floor is yours.
Andy, thank you for the great introduction and for hosting this event. It is great to be able to join with you and with all of the other participants today. And it's also great to be able to have this conversation with James, who, as you noted in the introductions, served on the policy planning staff, which is where we first met. But since then has remained a great friend and someone who, while he was posted in Beijing, I was always very happy to see during my trips there. We had, you're right, originally planned to do this event months ago. Fortunately, I hope the topic of the book is still relevant. I think it is, and I'm eager to be able to discuss it and then to field questions from the audience. So China's Western Horizon, this new book, has its origins really in my work on South Asia, and especially my work in my last book on how the Pakistan, India, China, US, if you might say quadrilateral or four-way relationship was evolving. And I really started thinking about that topic well over a dozen, probably well, at least a decade ago, maybe a dozen years ago, as I was working on that book, as I was working on some other assessments for the US government. But I realized as I was writing my last book that I really didn't have the space in that context to explore the issue at the depth that I wanted to. And so that gave rise to this project. This is a book that combines some degree of history, certainly to set the context for China's evolving relations in continental Eurasia, a significant amount of basic data collection on what is actually happening on the ground in the region. Also, a number of interviews, which I conducted, of course, in Washington and in the States more broadly with experts based here, but also I had an opportunity in this, as I was researching this book, to travel to all of the countries that I focus on in the book, except for one important exception, that being Iran, which was, I thought, off limits to me during this period. The book is informed also by my background. You know, it starts and it is framed in broadly, and I'll speak to this in a little more depth, political science terms. I'm trained in international relations. But it gets at questions that became more and more relevant to me as I came to Washington, D.C. and started thinking in policy terms, certainly at the State Department, and then also at the Council on Foreign Relations, and now, of course, at SAIS. And it's my attempt to make sense of a really huge set of developments that is really hard to wrap your mind around, that crosses politics, economics, and security issues across this vast geographical sweep of territory to China's west. But at the same time, I wanted to do so in a way that really stresses regional, national, and localized context, rather than just the macro level analysis, which in and of itself is quite important, but wasn't getting at the kinds of issues that I wanted to tackle. And that's because the book, ultimately, if it does one thing analytically, it is that it stresses the agency or the importance of local actor interests, local principally at the national level, but in some cases even more localized than that. It stresses the extent to which the interests and the aspirations of these other states, states that are smaller, weaker, poorer than China in every instance, actually shape and affect, constrain, frame what China is up to in the region. And in those three case studies, the main case studies of the book, which really focus on South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, I try to play this story out in different ways, because of course the local logics do differ. It isn't the same story in every instance. Now, to illustrate the agency of local actors, the book opens with the story of Gwadar Port. And I imagine many of you who are watching today are familiar with this, but Gwadar Port is this new Arabian deep sea port on the Arabian Sea and Pakistan's sea coast. It is a port that got China's backing to help build and finance in January 2000, when then President of Pakistan, Musharraf, went to China to ask his Chinese counterparts for technical and financial assistance. And as that story was related to me some years later, the Chinese were actually quite surprised by President Musharraf's request. They didn't immediately see the value commercially or strategically of this port, and they even went so far as to go back and ask Musharraf's handlers and entourage whether he was serious about this request. Now, that story, which I subsequently in an interview had an opportunity to confirm with President or former President Musharraf, was only surprising to me because sitting in Washington, D.C., Gwadar Port was often identified as one of a number of string of pearls, of bases or places along the Indo-Pacific rim that seem to have been identified by strategists in Beijing as strategic opportunities for where China could plant its flag to extend its influence across the region. But in fact, the story of Gwadar actually shows several important things. Again, it stresses local actor agency because, as I say, the idea for the port, the impulse behind the port was Musharraf's, or Pakistan's more generally. He saw the port as strategically valuable in his contest with India, which was quite hot at that time. He saw China's backing in that port as demonstrating China's backing, strategic backing more broadly. And he wanted to pursue it also for domestic political reasons. In the years after that initial decision, the ground reality of that port, which didn't go anywhere terribly quickly for almost the first decade of it having been launched, was stymied or hindered or delayed, slowed because of other local realities, because of a separatist movement in Balochistan, the province of Pakistan where this port is located, and local resentment and violence directed at Chinese workers and Pakistanis who were endeavoring to build out this port. And that suggested a local reality of a sense that China's involvement wasn't helping local populations, or at least wasn't perceived to by many of those populations themselves. Those local realities, of course, were interacting with what I have come to see as a general trend of Chinese opportunistic behavior across this region, strategic opportunism. That is, this may not have been China's grand scheme from the outset, something that Beijing had dreamed up and found on a map. But once that opportunity presented itself, China is now, and has been for some time, in a position to take advantage of it and to seek to advance these opportunities. And so in total, the initial push for this port and then the on-again, off-again development of the port reflects the push-pull of Pakistani interests on the one hand, national and local, as well as Chinese interests. And this I present as the opening of the book because it repeats this storyline, or a storyline similar to it, repeats with very different details across this broad region of continental Eurasia. So it is China's rising wealth, its political influence, its military power. That is the big new story of really this century, and that applies to this region as well. But China does not act in a vacuum. And to focus too much attention purely on what China wants, or what we can think China wants by looking at Beijing or studying what's happening within China itself, leads to only, I think, a partial story of what is actually unfolding on the ground throughout this region. So if we want to understand the fuller story, we need to look at both elements. And that's what I do in the book. So in the book, I do have several other principal goals. I do want to help my primary audience, and I take that to be principally American readers. I want to help them understand the connections that exist across continental Eurasia and how this region to China's west, the title of the book being China's Western Horizon, how this region is increasingly relevant to China's rise and to its aspirations in the future. Although most of us sitting in the United States have historically thought more of China as an East Asian or East Asian Pacific power. In fact, if you look at a map, and here I want to share a map from the book, if I can do so quickly. Here you can see a map from the book, which basically gives you a sense as to if you were to imagine what China looks like, but from a continental Eurasian perspective. And the connections between China, and if you look here, you can see the closeness of Western China to, of course, Central Asia, and even onward into the Middle East, gives you a different sense as to China's role or place in the world. And of course, here, I must say, of course, this is not rocket science, but neither is it an intuition or an impulse that came up on my own. My early work on appreciating the interconnections across continental Eurasia was influenced by a number of other scholars, including SAIS's own Professor Ken Calder, who had written extensively about this and continues to work on this topic. And some of my early thinking about these interconnections was certainly influenced by that. So I wanted to make that point clear. I also wanted to give a sense as to what China is up to in the region. And so, as I say, that's not the only story, but I do think it's a story worth telling. China is doing new and different things economically, politically, and even militarily over the past decade plus that we need to appreciate, not just in the Asia-Pacific context, but in the continental Eurasian one. And so I wanted to stress those two. And these things that China is doing too often get simplified or kind of brought down to the level of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is indeed an umbrella and significant component to what China is doing. But then too often, I think analysts, at least in the United States, simplify the Belt and Road Initiative as being one of infrastructure development and investment. But what China is doing in this region often extends well beyond that. As I say, to political and even military and security, has certainly security implications. And sometimes if we focus on the infrastructure, I think we miss too much of these other stories. And the last piece of the book that I wanted to do was I wanted to offer suggestions for how the United States ought to respond to all of these changing circumstances. So the core cases in the book look at Pakistan in South Asia, Kazakhstan in Central Asia, and Iran in the Middle East. And the analytical process that I use to try to answer questions about what is going on is effectively a two-step. It's fairly simple, but it's a two-step process. The process is simple. The complexity comes with the reality on the ground of what's actually unfolding. And the process begins with a question that I think is familiar to many folks who, unlike me, have been trained as comparativists. The question here is, what's happening on the home front or in terms of the domestic political economy of any of these individual states, and how is that being affected by China's greater role within these economies, within these societies? And to make it even simpler than that, or at some level even cruder than that, the question is, who wins and who loses, or who wins more and who wins less from China's involvement? As China invests in a country like Kazakhstan, who stands to gain? And the answer in many of these instances, at least in the Kazakhstan case, is that the elites, the pre-existing power holders, often tend to gain a great deal more than the others. We can even see this over just the past week. There was a news story coming out of the Financial Times about corruption on the gas pipeline deals that Kazakhstan has built out to China, where former President Nazarbayev's son-in-law has apparently been bilking, who knows, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars on these deals. So it's clear who wins more out of some of these arrangements. But this is not just a story about infrastructure or skimming off the top. It also has to do with ways in which some of the regimes of the region are using China's backing to repress their own populations. And here the story of Iran is instructive. Iran's clerical regime is using Chinese technologies to surveil, to repress, to censor, to control the Iranian internet and telecommunications more broadly in ways that would be difficult for them to do with their own indigenous technologies, but which are being aided and abetted by China. And in each case, it is these local dynamics, not just the Chinese interests again, that drive this story. The changes wouldn't be happening except for a certain degree of Chinese wealth or influence, but that is not the shaping device that defines the economies or the politics, or even what's happening within some of the security services of these states. So that's the first set of questions, the domestic political economy. The second set of questions has more to do with issues that are in the wheelhouse of international relations specialists. What is happening between the countries in each subregion and beyond? And how is China's greater involvement affecting that? And so what I see here is that some of the Eurasian states here are increasingly seeing China as an essential partner in their efforts to achieve security or other competitive goals in the region. While other states see China and increasingly are wary of China's involvement because they see it as problematic. And the case of South Asia here is instructive. Of course, Pakistan has increasingly, and for a long time, but now even more so, sees China's backing as essential to its dealings with India. And India, for its part, is increasingly concerned not just about Pakistan as a longtime hostile neighbor, but also about China's involvement and backing of Pakistan. And that has led to India being increasingly skeptical, not just about Pakistan itself, but about the nature of its relationship with China. And on net, that has produced a more unstable, tumultuous, and potentially quite dangerous regional dynamic that really is developing in large part on the back of China's greater involvement. We see different versions of this across the region, and for reasons of time, I won't get into them, but just to look at the Middle East, we see a similar competitive dynamic between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but in that instance, both Iran and Saudi Arabia also appreciate that they have strong and increasing interests in having tight ties with Beijing, not least because China is a principal buyer of what they have to sell in terms of hydrocarbons, but also because China has been willing to provide them sensitive military technologies, which have been unavailable from other sources, including nuclear-capable missiles in Saudi Arabia or drone technology in Iran. Now, these are all ways in which China's involvement has, I think, played to ramp up or at least keep alive regional competitions, and which I think this dynamic is likely to persist. Let me wrap up now because I'm nearly out of the time I wanted to spend on my remarks, and I want to get to questions. But I will just say this adds up in a mixed series of ways for the United States. If you think from an American perspective, what does this mean for us? Economically, across the region, it is a mixed story. There are some benefits, and I think we should appreciate, to having Chinese investment in roads and rails and other areas of the Eurasian infrastructure in ways that directly benefit or can benefit American companies, but can also benefit the region's economic development writ large. But there are also cons, especially as we're seeing parts of these societies or these economies, as China becomes more involved, others, including American companies and Europeans and other East Asian countries, have more difficulty breaking into these markets. Politically, the story is even messier, but generally less pleasant. Chinese influence is creating headaches across the region, and I think will continue to do so, particularly in that it is backing and giving a lifeline to the region's autocrats and illiberal regimes in a way that without China, they would have less economic, certainly, and even political and in some ways security backing than they now do. And there's no reason to anticipate that China will become any greater of a supporter for liberal values or democratic practices across the region. So this is likely to persist. And then finally, on the security front, I would just observe that there are two problems. One, I've pointed to already, regional security competitions, say between India and Pakistan or Saudi Arabia and Iran, will persist despite China's greater involvement in the region. China has not shown a willingness or ability to clamp down or to pacify these conflicts. But simultaneously, China is also finding that the region is open to greater projection of its own military capabilities, its own involvement in terms of intelligence, collection, and liaison relationships across the region. And I anticipate that this will persist as well over the long term, which will have broader strategic consequences for the United States in its competition with Beijing. So much more that I could say, but I think I put plenty on the table for now, and I'm a couple minutes over where I wanted to be. So if we can bring James in, then we'll be off to the races. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dan and Andy, for inviting me. Good to be back at SAIS, even if it's virtual with a fun background. Your book, really, for those who haven't read it, if I can get it in the screen there, is incredibly readable. You know, I think we've all read a lot of policy tomes about how capitals work and decision makers figure out what to put in place to advance the interests of their country. And Dan's book reads like a journalistic novel in a lot of ways. And so I appreciated, Dan, the effort you took not only to travel to these countries, but actually to make it a very readable story about what's happening, including, as you say, the way you start your book out. You know, when the talk of China as an expanding peer competitor seems to have consumed official Washington, and I can say that as someone who's no longer living in Washington, but for my colleagues who are still there, it does seem to be the zeitgeist of the moment and of the focus of the blob. When I was at SAIS, a newly minted PhD named Mike Green was just finishing up his dissertation on Japanese techno-nationalism, and he was teaching a class before he went on to CSIS and the White House, the National Security Council, and then another university in Washington that shall remain nameless. But the reason I mentioned Mike Green's book, dissertation, and his focus on techno-nationalism is to, you know, if we think back at that time, when I went to SAIS in the early 90s, Japan was literally taking over the world. And this is what everyone focused on. And this was the focus of Asian studies in particular, but more broadly of kind of foreign policy thinkers was, you know, what is the Japanese way and how does it threaten the U.S. primacy in a lot of different areas. And, you know, I don't know that we'll look back on this phase of history and say, oh, you know, those concerns about China were overblown. But I do think it's worth putting in perspective that right now, sure, it's very hot. And, you know, China's ascendancy is the focus of what many people are working on. As someone who spent, you know, 2+ decades working on China, on the one hand, sure, it's interesting. People said to me, oh, you're lucky you studied China. And I said, I don't know if it's lucky. You know, I spent a year in Wuhan in the early 90s. That's not luck. That was hard investment in making sure that this issue would be known to more people. But I only say that to say that we have to have a little bit of distance and humility as we look at kind of what's happening in China. What I particularly liked about Dan's book was this very realist view of foreign policy. And maybe we can get to more of that in the discussion of, you know, how much of what China is doing. Dan, you hinted at some of it in your remarks, is this kind of authoritarianism versus liberalism, kind of larger clash of ideology and civilizations. And how much of it is in your book is very kind of block and tackle parts of foreign policy, and it doesn't get into a lot of that. And I think that's some of what animates the blob and the peer competitor discussion in Washington is really over those ideological things. So I'd be interested to hear what you, Dan, and Andy have to say on that. But maybe I could just take one step back and not get too far back historical, but just kind of see where we are on Chinese foreign policy, which has gone through a bunch of different phases over the last 150 years, from the Opium Wars to foreign invasion, partition, civil war, Sino-Soviet friendship, and then split, war with the US and Korea, retrenchment during the Cultural Revolution, and then exporting revolution towards the end of the Cultural Revolution in the 70s. And then comes Zhang Xiaoping, who decided on a kind of a different path for Chinese domestic and foreign policy, reform and opening, and basically a fair amount of pragmatism, hiding capabilities and biding time, or Taokang Yanghui. You know, we're now, and that was from 1978, the third plenum, until, you know, you pick the point, and maybe we can talk about that when it turned. But now we're clearly in a phase of Chinese foreign policy that's more assertive. There's a wolf warrior diplomats, and I want Dan Markey to tell his personal interactions with wolf warrior diplomat number one when we get to the Q&A portion, given his time interacting with Zhao Lijian. But something has changed on the Chinese side. I'm just going to mention my podcast project, in which I spoke to 24 former US officials on how they dealt with China. And I kind of asked this question of, where did that shift come, where the Chinese foreign policy apparatus was less interested in learning from others, less interested in becoming part of the global system, and more interested in asserting its own role. And there's no definitive date, but I would put it in about 2006 to 2010. I think most people point to the financial crisis in 2008, in which the US financial system caused a global economic calamity, and the Chinese thinkers were re-examining how much the US model, both of a governance model and an economic model, was one that they wanted to follow. As a friend of mine said, Zhang Xiaoping had this saying of crossing the stream by feeling the stones. And, the Chinese have reached the other side of the bank, they're at the other side of the river. And so there's no more stones for them to feel anymore. And so they've got to figure out how to do this on their own. And as I said, that time from about 2006 to 2010 is where I think most people, at least in my podcast series, kind of pointed to that change in Chinese approach. I think the other parts of that, in addition to the financial crisis, were the U.S. Long commitment in the greater Middle East, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq really taking a toll. And I think on the Chinese side, as I said, a realization that, maybe Big Brother America no longer has so much to teach us. So I think the question is, will this assertiveness stick or not? That is, we're at this phase, and if you just draw a straight line of China was essentially a world taker of norms and now is being more assertive. I don't think it's intellectually honest to say, well, for the next 25 or 50 years, they're only going to go one way. They're only going to be assertive. So I think actually, what we'll see with the incoming Biden team and a kind of post-crackdown in Hong Kong and Xinjiang is a possibility that the Chinese foreign policy elite will say, you know what, we've actually accomplished what we need to domestically. And by domestic, I mean both Xinjiang and Hong Kong. And we've warned foreign powers like Australia that should know better than to try to challenge China on these core issues. And so actually now is an opportunity, 2021, 2022, for Beijing to be more friendly, to say, hey, let's restart things. And if you look at the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement that was just signed earlier this month, and talk about resuming a trilateral FTA between Korea, China, and Japan, you could see a scenario where there's a modulation in Chinese assertiveness brought by a range of different factors, but it's not simply a straight line of China's going to be pushing its agenda across the world, until 2035, which is when the Communist Party says that they're going to have a society that is essentially a mature, developed society. So I guess I wanted to start, Dan, with your book, if I can, how further integration of the region, the Western region, won't kind of serve U.S. interests. I guess I would just ask, and we've talked about this before, so I'm putting you on the spot again. I would just ask, U.S. foreign policy approaches to a lot of countries has been, shall we say, mixed. And I don't just mean military adventurism. I mean even the debt crisis in Latin America in the 80s, which I studied at SAIS before we had a real financial crisis that the U.S. started. I think you could argue, some of your book is saying that the elites in these countries are profiting, which then kind of undermines legitimacy and in some cases stable government. And I guess I would just contrast that with, is U.S. engagement in this region or in other regions, has that brought the stability that you would like to see and the engagement? And so that, I don't disagree with your conclusion, but if you're comparing Chinese interaction with these different countries and this region with, say, U.S. interaction, again, not with this region necessarily, but kind of more broadly, can you say the Chinese are doing worse than a other large power would do, like the United States, in interacting with the region in how they're doing both, as you say, kind of security issues and kind of economic engagement?
First of all, great sort of table setting and kind of putting some of this into context, and certainly also offering more of a view from both from in the context of China-US competition, but also in the context of where is China itself going? Because while that is a part of the book, I will say, the analytical weight of the book does lie more firmly on these issues of what do these other countries want? Because I feel that you and others, many others as well, are providing us with a great deal more insight than I necessarily could about what's happening in Beijing. So I'm trying to fill out the other side of the story. So that's useful, I think. But let me make a couple of points here. One would be simply, you've asked the question about whether China is on a straight line trajectory upward in terms of being motivated and able to project itself into this region and others globally. And of course, we don't know the answer to that. But one of the things that the work on this book has pointed out to me is it's not always a question of just what does China want. There's been a great deal of openness in certain parts of continental Eurasia to greater Chinese penetration, and indeed to pulling China in, even in ways that a more risk-averse China, which it may well be down the line, would have trouble figuring itself out a way to avoid. Just as other great powers have been entangled in messy regions where they have considerable interests, but would much prefer not to have to choose or make tough calls, say between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East, where China is now. I think that's what China will be looking at. They will be finding that they're in bed with multiple different players, that they are being pulled in different directions by their own interests, but also by these interests. And it will be tough for them to navigate this skillfully. And that gets to the broader question you're asking, am I being harsh in a sense in terms of my interpretation of China by saying that it is not bringing stability as if somebody else did bring stability? And the answer is, of course, that's an unfair characterization. The reason, though, that I make that argument is that I have frequently been confronted with a different kind of argument, certainly in US policy circles, which is to say, okay, these are messy, unfortunate countries, many of them. People use harsher terms than that at times to describe countries like Pakistan or Central Asia or Iran. If China wants to have them, so to speak, let them, is the argument that's sometimes presented to me. As if, and as I pursue that argument, it's often the assumption is, look, if China gets more involved and manages to project its influence, but it becomes China's problem, then it's no longer our problem, and that relieves us of some strategic responsibilities in the world, which is useful to us over the long term. And my concern is that China's involvement doesn't necessarily bring greater stability or peace in the region, and it doesn't even necessarily shift the frustrations, angers, and politicized violence of the region necessarily toward China. So China's greater involvement in the Middle East doesn't solve the Middle East for us. China's greater involvement in Pakistan doesn't make all the problems that we confronted over the past 2 decades in Pakistan, unsuccessfully, I might say, but doesn't make those problems go away. So we could be confronting the worst of all possible worlds, which is a region in which China has simultaneously a degree of greater influence and access and capacity over the long term to project power, military power even, across this continental sweep in a way that we haven't seen out of China yet. So it could simultaneously have that, and the region could continue to be a messy, violent, unstable region in which no one is actually picking up the responsibility to promote the types of more healthy political and economic reforms or bring about greater peace or normalization between the powers of the region. And that's an uncomfortable conclusion, but looks to me more likely than not, more likely than a Chinese imperium that resolves the continent's problems, and more likely than a region that puts up such a stiff barrier to China that this apparent impulse to expand its influence comes to a full stop. Some messy middle is going to be the reality.
Thanks, Dan. I do think you've put your finger on a real challenge that Chinese diplomats face, and they're certainly much more capable now than in the 1990s, but dealing with complex, different parts of open societies is just something that Chinese diplomats have a difficult time doing. It's not something that they have done at home. I'm not saying they can't do it, but it really adds a layer of complexity when you have opposition parties and media and civic interest groups and dealing with all those sorts of things. It's a challenge for any country diplomatically, certainly for the United States. but much, much more so for Chinese diplomats. I wanted to ask you, and I'm not putting you on the spot, but you pick kind of three countries that they're all important ones, but ones that in two of them, in my experience, are kind of outliers. And I wanted to, I only have a master's from SCI, so I don't have a PhD in international relations theory or in comparative politics. But I'm just wondering the representativeness of these three. When I started my career, I was following Chinese proliferation activity with countries around the globe. And at that time, it was Pakistan, the DPRK, Syria, Iran, Libya, and a couple of others, Saudi Arabia. But two of them really stood out. And part of it was in the 90s that those interactions were then curbed thanks to US pressure. And the Chinese realization that having the world with lots of nuclear weapons was not in China's interest, separate from Mao's view of nuclear weapons being something that should be democratized and all countries should have. But my question is, for Pakistan and Iran, there's long-standing ties between China and those two countries. And I guess, Kazakhstan, I think, is quite different. And I think that is a case of a country that, there were no long-standing ties with, certainly before the Soviet Union fell apart. And even afterwards, it's a more kind of normal interaction. But for historical reasons, I think the last diplomatic envoy that the Shah of Iran saw was actually a vice premier from China. Maybe that's in your book. I don't recall if we talked about that. So, and then Pakistan, for all the reasons that you stated, China basically gave nuclear weapons to Pakistan and missiles to deliver them. And so, that's kind of a unique relationship. So I guess if you could just talk a little bit about, I think those are three very important countries, and for the U.S. policymakers, they're ones that we focus on, so it makes sense. But could you talk a little bit about the representativeness of those three case studies and how it does or doesn't kind of fit in with, there's probably more than a dozen other countries that don't have that special relationship, and how you ended up picking those and how representative are they?
Yeah, great question. The more of a research method question than I would have anticipated from you, James. But it's a great question. Look, the reason for my selection of these cases was less related to representativeness and more related to significance, and not just significance in the way that you've identified, which is, yes, two of these are seeking or have already achieved nuclear weapons capability and are high on America's list of global nuclear proliferation concerns. The third, Kazakhstan, is not. But that wasn't really what drove me to it. It was more that I perceived that these three countries were increasingly important to China's own interests. And so if we were likely to see a significant Chinese involvement, it was more likely to pop out from these cases. And if they were representative, it would be more along the lines of, if we do anticipate that at least China's wealth or capacity for involvement in other states in the region is growing and not falling off of a cliff, then maybe we'll see the earlier stages of this in these countries. And then versions of that will play out elsewhere. The only bits of the book where I really try to make a case for applying a kind of a similar model to quite disparate case studies are in the analytical two-step that I described. First, and this is very simple stuff, but first ask who's winning and losing in terms of domestic political economy, then ask a similar question about how the states that are relevant in that region are seeing China in terms of their existing regional competitions, or in some cases even global international relations competitions. And so it's more a matter of which questions to ask than it is determining that actually in each state you're seeing similar dynamics unfold. But where I do see, at the same time, I want to draw some sort of broader conclusions here. And I would just simply say, look, at a basic level, in all of these three cases, and I, of course, have paid close attention to how China is interacting with other states around the world, we do have to be very wary and concerned about the possibility that the elites within these societies, and particularly within relatively closed, even certainly illiberal, and in some cases close to authoritarian or even authoritarian states, a slim veneer of society stands to gain a great deal, to profit a great deal from its relations with China. And in all of the cases that I've seen, these three that I really highlight, plus some others that I look at there are reasons for concern that they're profiting from their relationship with China is actually creating or exacerbating existing cleavages within these societies. Partly because they're winning economically and they're making money in ways that others are not, and partly for cultural and political reasons having to do with some of China's other activities. And here I would point to China's treatment of Muslims and Uyghurs in particular within China resonates throughout much of this region because much of this region is Muslim majority, and raises all kinds of questions about why the leaders of these states, including in Iran, for instance, or Saudi Arabia, are not more critical of China publicly, despite the fact of what China is doing. So I see certain continuities, but by and large, my prescription for policymakers is to focus on the local realities, to really look at each individual case and certainly at each nation or nation state case specifically and build from there. Rather than try to imagine that there's a kind of a continuity, a seamless continuity across this region. And in looking for those differences across states, policymakers, I think, American policymakers are also more likely to find opportunities, because now you're asking questions about what do these states want? What are their aspirations? Where is China helping them to meet these aspirations? And what might we do a better job at that? And those are the kinds of ways that will give us an in for influence and opportunity, continued partnerships and relationships with states that we want to have, or coercive capacity over states that we're concerned about, in ways that just looking at this region as a playground for China and US-China competition will not offer us that opportunity.
I think we're ready for Professor Murtha to get to the Q&A. Maybe I could just set the table, and I know he's going to have some remarks, by just asking us to think a little bit about how a Biden team should be dealing with the Belt and Road. That is, this is something when we were in policy planning that was, at the time, was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the question of, well, should the U.S. kind of participate in it, and do you give it some kind of validity, or do you just turn around and don't do anything? What the Trump administration did for the Belt and Road Summit was to send a senior director from the NSC, Matt Pottinger, to go kind of as the representative, and he had a little pull aside with Xi Jinping. So that's one way to do it, is kind of a light touch engagement. But I think that there's an opportunity now with a new crew coming in to kind of figure out how this signature Chinese initiative is something the U.S. should react to.
Great one. Andy, I'll pass it over to you, and I can pick that up and others as we go.
Thanks very much. So thanks to both of you, Dan and James, really useful remarks. And I would love to be able to add to it. Unfortunately, or fortunately, unfortunately for me, but fortunately for everybody else, we've got some really good questions. So what I'll do is, rather than ask my questions now, I'll try to build them in to the to my final comments. And even though it looks like I'm going to be ascending to heaven from this backlit room, while let me ask the first question while you answer it. I'll try to take care of the AV on my end. So the first question is from Marsha Wiss, and she asks, China's BRI investments are often associated with bribes to local officials and elites. Do you see the Chinese seeing it in their interest to not be associated with this corruption? Actually, why don't can I ask maybe two questions at a time?
Yeah, that's fine.
We can get through them a little bit better. The second question is from Gary Talrico, who asks, the US and Japan have so far refused to join the AIIB, whereas all our major allies have joined, and we have been reluctant to give China more influence in terms of voting power in international organizations. So the question is, to what extent do you think this has been counterproductive and set China on the unilateral approach with the BRI and some of its more aggressive geopolitically driven projects? Where should US policy be more accommodating and recognize the arrival of China and embrace some of their goals? So that fits in really nicely with the way James teed this up. So
yeah, no, these are great questions. And I think at root, what we're grappling with is how to compete with China on the one hand, but also look for means to limit, constrain, or focus that competition in ways that will help us avoid counterproductive outcomes, like being, as I describe in the book, the only skunk at the party. We don't always have to be in a position to see what China is doing, whatever it is, and say, that's bad because China did it. Not only is that not a smart move just because it's on its face, it may be objectively incorrect, but it's also not smart because many of the states that we're looking to work with, particularly in continental Eurasia, they do not see us putting forward alternatives that are of similar scale or on offer in means that they can ingest easily in terms of investment or technical capabilities as compared to what China is able to put on the table. And so if we've got nothing, we can't beat the something that the Chinese are offering, and we need to be very aware of that. And in terms of absenting ourselves from multilateral institutions, even ones that China is at the head of, I think we've seen the downsides to that as well. In other words, with the AIIB, you sit out at your own peril. Of course, if you trace this back, the original sin that in a number of ways led to the AIIB was not providing China the space that it objectively deserved by its heft in the international system, in the international economic order, in existing multilateral settings, which would have possibly led to China being less effective at making the case for setting up its own institutions that it would be in charge of. Now, the AIIB so far seems, as far as I can tell, not to be a terribly troubling institution at all, and one that the longer that it's in business, the more normal it appears to be. And I could imagine, aside from the politics of competing with China being so central to thinking here in Washington, D.C., I could imagine a future somewhere down the line in which we saw it as being more in our interest to be involved in that institution in particular. But with the BRI, I think there are some big questions about even how China is being forced by the realities in the world to reimagine, to step back, to, you might say, right size, but in most cases this means downsize its aspirations and its operations in many of the countries, even some of the countries that I focus on, like Pakistan. But the dollar figures and the big projects seem to be coming into smaller bite-sized pieces and are being reframed in ways that reflect, again, local interests in jobs, in opportunities at home for, say, Kazakhstanis or others in Central Asia to actually make money off of these things, and not to see the resources flood back into China. So there's already been a kind of a recalibration of the BRI, forced in large part by global responses to China. And so I think that gets at this question of, does Beijing appreciate the downside risks of being perceived as feeding bribery in a lot of these states? Yes, I think it does. Does that mean that it will come clean? And no, it also sees some upside benefits to projecting its influence in some of these states. So that will continue to be a tool that is more available to Chinese operators than, say, American ones. But they also see some of the downsides to that, as well as the downsides to overpromising and under-delivering more generally. And so this is a process, and this won't happen overnight. As one Chinese expert on South Asia put it to me, he said, you've been at this, meaning at infrastructure development and investment globally, for decades now. You've learned from that process. Have a little patience with us. It's going to take us some time. And so I think we need to see that learning unfolding in lots of different ways. Even if I, as with many others, I'm worried and skeptical about some of the political and even economic ramifications of these projects. So I'm not sort of eager to jump into BRI or tell the Biden administration, hey, the water's warm, dive right in, this is a wonderful thing, we should turn this upside down. No, there are some pretty significant problems here. And it's not clear how we would really participate in BRI anyway, in any significant way. But in some other narrower areas like AIIB, I could see that as a part of a future agenda.
Maybe I'll just quickly add, yeah, I look forward to having a Pompeo administration sometime in the late 2020s join the AIIB. That should be a very, very,
Yeah, I don't see
very,
that happening.
yeah, very good point of reference. No, I completely agree. I think the U.S. needs a little bit more self-confidence that some things we're going to join and some things we're not. I think, frankly, I agree with Dan completely. Where AIIB is today is actually not bad. A friend of mine in Beijing was actually working, a foreigner, not a Chinese person, was working at AIIB. And she just said the management of it was crazy. That it was, there was this fiction of having different board members being able to vote, but the reality was like the message came down from the Ministry of Finance and here's what was going to happen. And so there's some serious governance issues with AIIB. All that said, I agree with Dan. I think in a couple of years, I don't see any reason why the US shouldn't join. I guess I would just say, I think the Chinese narrative, to Dan's point there, was China was being not represented enough in existing international institutions. You know, in my view, I know the administration pushed hard, the Obama administration, to get the quota increase at the IMF. You know, I'm not sure anything that the U.S. could have done could have forestalled the launching of AIIB. You know, China needed these signature leadership sorts of activities and projects, and that one was there. I think for Belt and Road, I think the Chinese don't know what it is, to be honest, in a lot of ways. So I'm not sure the U.S. should sign up for something that is quite amorphous. What I find particularly troubling on what Chinese diplomats seem to be doing is insisting that the Belt and Road be mentioned in every single gathering of world leaders and UN proclamations. And in my view, it smacks a little bit of the Cultural Revolution, the idea that, the great leaders' words and projects have to be endorsed by the world, by global society. It's kind of ridiculous. And so, my view is if the Chinese can actually enunciate what the Belt and Road is supposed to do and not do, and it becomes a bit more routinized and less associated with a certain leader and cult of personality around that leader, then I don't think the projects in and of themselves are necessarily objectionable. But to have the U.S. sign up to it at this point when, as Dan said, there's a fair amount of retrenchment, I'm not really sure that we should do that. I think probably strategic ignorance for the next couple of years or indifference might serve us better.
Great, thanks to both of you. I'm going to try to combine some of the questions that have been asked, you have anticipated and answered. So let me ask maybe three more shorter ones, just so that we can have time to get at them. So Jesse Young asks, first, thanks for this presentation, Dr. Markey. One question: it is my sense that we often talk about China as a single unified actor, when the Chinese system is actually, he says, fairly federal. I would disagree with that term. I would say decentralized. But the center sets industrial and policy goals, and the provinces do best to meet them, et cetera. To what degree do we slide that governing nuance when we talk about Xi acting or China acting? Is the country really a unitary actor in its affairs with its Western neighbors? I could, and I do teach a whole course on this. So I mean, I think it's an absolutely central question. Just two more quicker questions to ask, if not to answer. Jacob Larson asks, what are some potential quagmires for China in Central Asia, South Asia, the Middle East? And then from David Sedney, Dan, question from Kabul. Noting that, for example, both India and China have economic, military, security interests in Central Asia, both have bases in Tajikistan, for example, do you see Central Asia becoming an arena of Sino-Indian competition as the US pulls back?
Great questions. All easy. So first, on the Jesse's question about China as unified or decentralized, Jesse needs to come back. Now he's already done the MAGP at SAIS. He needs to come back and take Professor Murtha's course to answer that question for himself. But the short answer is, of course, just like any enormous country, it's complicated. Is the United States a unified actor on the world stage? When we've got global multinational corporations often effectively running their own policies, or states around the United States that often conduct, California practically has its own foreign policy on certain issues. Why would China be any different, I would ask, in this regard? Of course, at some level, in terms of the kind of work that I'm doing, there's a simplification required to make sense of it and to label it, and then to identify where some of these new activities are coming from. And that's why we call them Chinese. Now, to more fully understand whether they reflect a localized impulse, say an investment in Pakistan, reflect something more about concerns in Xinjiang about direct connections and the conveyance of goods across the border, or whether it actually reflects something back in Beijing having to do with state-owned enterprises or something else altogether, that's a different story. That's not the story that I was telling in this book. It's an important one because I think that story and so many other things that James has been talking about Chinese goals and aspirations, but also capabilities and the complexity that will lead to maybe sometimes non-linear or unanticipated policies coming out of Beijing. A lot of that story is a domestic Chinese story, but that's not the story of this book. So I'll leave it at that, but it's an important one. In terms of quagmires in the region, Iran sort of jumps out. This is a tough one for China to manage. It already has been. One of the most interesting and, to my eye, surprising features of China's involvement with Iran over the past 4 years, or almost 4 years of the Trump administration, is how careful Beijing has been about exposing itself to additional risk overtly by its dealings with Iran. So there are all kinds of stories about how Iran is aiming to circumvent US-led sanctions, and a lot of the oil seems to be ending up ultimately in China. But how that has happened has been more under the radar than I would have anticipated, given how blatant the Trump administration was in withdrawing the United States from the JCPOA, what a slap that was against an existing agreement that all had signed up to. You might have imagined China taking a more aggressive approach and really using this as a means to kind of stick its thumb in America's eye, but you didn't see that. And part of that, I think, is certainly a Chinese sense that first, it probably didn't want to pick yet another fight with Washington. And second, that Iran is a messy, difficult partner and comes with a lot of baggage internally in terms of the way it runs its own country, as well as how it deals with all of its neighbors. And China's well aware of that too. So it's taken a slower approach there, and that's a reflection of its appreciation of Iran as a potential quagmire. And then from Kabul, great to hear from you. The question there being, is Central Asia shaping up to be a venue for Sino-Indian cooperation? Would that it could be, from an Indian perspective, be a serious competition? Maybe in Kabul, where India has had a greater degree of involvement historically, and where there has been a receptivity among a number of Afghans to seeing greater Indian involvement, not least because of their fear and anger, frustration with Pakistan, which makes India a kind of an attractive partner, and where China has actually taken a lighter approach, a less involved approach, at times than even the United States was hoping or expecting it would, certainly in terms of investment over early in the latest round of Afghan wars. So you can imagine, at least sitting in Kabul, I think something of a more significant Indian involvement and a more balanced Chinese involvement. But if you're looking at the rest of Central Asia, India's capacity, leverage, and influence is so weak compared to what China has to offer, certainly economically, but also technologically, and increasingly politically, that it's not playing that same game. And I think Indians would be deluding themselves to think that they really are. Iran would be more than happy to go with China on Chabahar, for instance, and seems like it may in fact go that direction and leave India in the dust. Because it doesn't feel that India really has its back or has significant enough things to offer. Just last point, James, you mentioned Secretary Pompeo and suggested it may be President Pompeo. Well, we'll see about that. But that aside, the interesting thing about Pompeo is he's been on a whirlwind tour at times of this region, including Kazakhstan and Sri Lanka and elsewhere. And he always has framed the issue of dealing with China in a with us or against us way, which has gone over, from what I can tell, like a lead balloon. in these countries. I met with a group of, actually Andy and I met with some Kazakhstani scholars shortly after Pompeo had been there. And, it was clear that his message, the American message, hasn't resonated because these countries, like others, don't want to have to choose. They don't see themselves as inherently pro-US or pro-Beijing. They certainly don't want to see this framed in broad ideological terms where they have to have some ideological allegiance or adherence to some broader set of ideals. They have their interests, often very local, very parochial, and they want to know who's going to help them achieve these interests. And they're open to us just as they're open to China, and they'll remain open to us. I don't think they'll want to close the door because it doesn't help them to close the door.
So,
Andy, maybe I could
please go ahead, James. Yeah.
I was just going to make two very quick points. First, on Jesse's one about the unitariness of Chinese action, I completely agree. I think there's a fair amount of intellectual laziness on the part, mostly of journalists and analysts who write about China, and they put China, or if they're being clever, Beijing in when they mean one specific part of the Chinese government system. Maybe it's the Chinese leadership, maybe it's the Ministry of Commerce, maybe it's the state-owned enterprise. And I think, as Dan said, we all just need to be better about what we're saying is Chinese, because I think it doesn't serve anyone's interest to be so unclear about who's doing the action. And then on Iran and quagmires, I would just tell a personal anecdote. When I was at the embassy in Beijing, this is 20 years ago now, the Chinese state oil company, CNPC, was listing on the New York Stock Exchange, and my predecessor had tried for years to get in to understand what CNPC was doing in Iran, and might it run afoul of Chinese sanctions. And for 2 years, the CNPC is like, we don't want to talk to you, go pound sand. And so because of my charming diplomatic skills, they actually decided to see me. The real reason, of course, was that Goldman Sachs told them they had to see someone from the American embassy, or they would not be able to list on the New York Stock Exchange. As part of the kind of due diligence, they had to just report to the US government what was happening. In the end, what CNPC did was they carved out their sensitive projects before they listed on the New York Stock Exchange as PetroChina. So that was not just the Iran projects, but all the rest of them. But all of which is to say, I think for really since the fall of the Shah, since the Islamic Revolution, the Chinese regime has been quite cautious about how they deal with Tehran. And so that was why I kind of mentioned the question of how representative is. I think you're right. And I often remind my China hawk friends of, China can do a lot of things that make the lives of Americans quite difficult. And in fact, in this case, they didn't. That is, that could have been a very good opportunity. U.S. pulls out of JCPOA, and China says, "Yep, we're going to buy all this oil, and we're going to, in fact, open up a new subway line in Tehran, and we're going to do all these other projects." And that was not in their interest. Again, I think the reason why, as Dan pointed out, the reason why Beijing policymakers made that decision was not to please the United States as such. It was because they realized dealing with Iran is a long-term, troubling, challenging relationship, and this benefit of a year of having the U.S. withdrawn is not going to pay off if they start engaging too closely with Tehran. They don't want to get into a position where they're too close to the regime there.
Yeah, that's a great point. We have to not just think of we have to think of all the moving parts, all the balls that are in the air, not simply the ones that we're necessarily focusing on from our point of view. Rather than going to the speed dating round of the questions, what I think I'd rather do is Alana Margulies asks one question, and I'd like to ask it to both of you. And it's more of a conceptual question, but it touches upon what both of you, particularly you, James, had mentioned, but I think, Dan, you've got a lot to say about this as well. She asks, she referenced your referencing of the policy of crossing the river by feeling the stones. And I guess one way of boiling down her question is that not kind of what China is doing now, in a sense, by engaging in this kind of opportunistic behavior versus having a larger strategic vision? Or is there, how would you distinguish between the two? Which I think would be a nice way of kind of putting a bow on all of this. James, why don't I ask you to go first, and then Dan, I'll give you the penultimate word, and I'll just thank everybody for being here.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think there's very large Chinese aspirations for global greatness and national rejuvenation. And then there's the pedestrian work of actually making that happen. And there's a huge gap in there. And so I actually don't think the strategic vision plays in much to what the day-to-day kind of, as I was saying, the block and tackle part of diplomacy, how that actually comes to pass. I think a lot of what happens is Chinese leaders or state-owned enterprises or other officials are opportunistic. And they have this grand idea that China should have a greater place in the world. Okay, how does that happen? Well, I've got this project here, I've got that there. So I think that probably doesn't kind of match up with the grand ambitions. In terms of feeling the stones to cross the river, I was using it as a, China had an idea of how to get out of extreme poverty and economic and social ravages of the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. And that was through opening up its economy, liberalizing society, and lots of other countries had done that. And so the stones in that analogy are Korea or Taiwan or even the United States. And if you look at the Chinese central bank, for example, they happen to have exactly the same number of regional branches as the US Federal Reserve does. And why is that? That's because someone else had already figured out how to set up regional banks at a central bank, and the US was that model. And so those stones were that model. And I guess what I meant was they've reached the other bank. There's no longer a model that China can follow. And so on the one hand, it's liberating for Chinese leaders to say, we can do whatever we want. On the other hand, it's kind of scary. We don't know how to actually go to the next stage across the desert or across whatever piece of terrain that the Chinese government and society has to go through. And so I think on the one hand, it's liberating and it allows for a strategic vision. On the other hand, it's kind of scary. If you can't count on the US or these other Asian tigers on what the next step is, you've got to figure this out on your own. And so that's where I think the Chinese leadership is in trying to figure out what comes next.
If I could just jump in just very, very quickly, in a sense, I think what we have to do is kind of rethink how we conceptualize China's international behavior. I mean, I think back to a book that came out, I think in 1995 by Barry Naughton called Growing Out of the Plan. And basically, and I'm bastardizing it a little bit here, but its thesis is that there really wasn't a model, that it really was trial and error. And these are all the different things that China was trying to do to get from point A to point B. And there wasn't this grand strategic vision beyond something that was really quite vague. And we're seeing the exact same thing now, one can argue, just internationally. Last point I wanted to make, James, is I think the point that you make about the period between 2006 and 2010, this lost weekend, if you will, I think that is a crucial piece of history that we need to unpack a lot more of, because a lot of kind of what stopped and what started, to really kind of bifurcate a China that I got to know very, very well, and then this, the China that has since emerged, which is quite different. I think that is something that really needs to be a lot more layers of that onion that need to be peeled. So I just wanted to give a shout out there. Dan?
Yeah, and that leads pretty directly to where I would take this, which is, while I agree with the points that James is making, and also James, your characterization of the crossing river and how you've put a finer point on it is, I think, really valuable because it's not simply building out a general framework and kind of messing around. It was seeing other examples and following those. And I think the distinction from that to where we are now and the broader distinction, which I guess maybe I would emphasize more, which is to say, we are seeing new and fundamentally different activity and behavior coming out of Beijing, out of China. Precisely why that is, or precisely who is driving that from the Chinese side is a debate that ought to be had. But how that is being felt in the countries where I've focused on is different. And so the character of Chinese involvement and investment in Pakistan, for instance, over the past decade, while China has had a deep and abiding relationship with Pakistan since the 1960s, this is different. This comes with a greater ambition, a significantly different rhetoric, a sense of vision or aspiration that completely outstrips what came before, and raises expectations, frankly, in these countries for what China is and ought to be in the near future. We can't lose sight of that difference too. This is, Iran's expectations for China today are different from what Iran might have expected in the 1980s when it was also buying weapons from the Chinese, or 10 years ago when it would have also been looking to sell oil to the Chinese. No, things have shifted. And that's what I wanted to kind of put a finer point on here, and to see how that has shifted. I think a lot of that storyline of big time change in East Asia and the Pacific has been laid out for us repeatedly, and we're seeing that. We see that more in our faces. But what's happening in continental Eurasia, less so. And that's what I wanted to put my finger on. Just in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, I like to talk about it kind of like we talked about big policy agendas or framing agreements in the US government. Often it looks like a Christmas tree that everybody is putting their own ornaments on, their own ornaments being the specific policy versions that they were already trying to push anyway, and just fitting them into that vision. But this is a new Christmas tree. Let's not lose sight of that. It's a big deal, and it's a significant change. And certainly it's seen that way from the outside. So again, thanks to both of you. This has been a real pleasure. I appreciate it.
Well, the pleasure has been mine. So I want to thank our audience for sticking with us, even though we're a few minutes over. I want to thank James Green for really, really wonderful comments that fleshed out the conversation in a really, I think, a really, really important way. Most of all, I want to thank you, Dan, for the work that you did and the work that you're doing. And there are still many, many questions that are left unanswered. That's the bad news. The good news is we all know where you live. So, we will continue to have this conversation. I think it's only going to grow in importance as we move forward. So once again, thank you everybody for attending, and we'll see you at the next faculty research forum next semester.
Thank you.